The thing that I want to highlight here is that most of language learning takes place outside of the classroom. And the reason for this is that, hello everyone, my name is William, aka the Swedish Polyglot, and in this video I will be discussing why it's very important to take responsibility when we're learning our target language. And I will basically be covering 3 primary reasons why we should take responsibility in our language learning. First, I will define what I mean by responsibility here. It's rarely that you would either not take responsibility at all or take full responsibility. On the one side of the spectrum, you have people who hand over all the responsibility of acquiring the target language to a teacher or an institution, such as a university or a language school. On the other side of the spectrum, you have people who take full responsibility for their language learning. They implement systems in their everyday life to acquire the language. They spend time every day listening passively to the language. They spend some active time in the language, 30 minutes an hour or more, engaging with the language actively, maybe reading, doing flashcards, stuff like that. So in this video, I will basically be comparing the people who give away all the responsibility and the people who take full responsibility. But keep in mind that there's a spectrum in between, where you could hand some responsibility to a teacher while still engaging with the language in your free time, for example. As a sake of comparison, I will be comparing the 2 extremes here. The first principle that I will be discussing is the fact that in order to acquire our target language, we typically need a lot of exposure to the language. And this means lots of listening, passive listening, lots of reading, flashcards, maybe just lots of exposure, basically. The thing that I want to highlight here is that most of language learning takes place outside of the classroom. And the reason for this is that the amount of time you spend with a tutor or an institution is always going to be less than how much free time you have, right? In general. So I'm a tutor. I teach languages on a website called italki. You can find the link in the description where you can find me if you want to learn Swedish, for example. So typically my students, they take maybe 1 hour a week, maybe 2 hours a week. And so the amount of exposure you could get through the lessons it's quite small, really. Like maybe if we're having a conversation where I'll be speaking half of the time or something like that, or less usually. But that's for the sake of argument here. Let's say I'm speaking half of the time. So a student who takes 2 hours of lessons per week, they would get just an hour of listening if they only did those lessons. While if that student also made sure that they had systems for listening in their free time, maybe they could listen an hour a day, they could easily exceed that number. And you need to exceed that number in order to acquire your target language. It's not enough to listen an hour a week. You have to listen like at least an hour a day or something like that, if you want to acquire the language in a reasonable time frame, that is. And so basically the amount of exposure you get if you rely solely on a tutor or an institution is going to be bottlenecked by your reliance on them, right? While if you're an independent learner, you can get how much input that you possibly could get within whatever time frame that whether it's in a day or in a week or so on. With responsibility, you could get much more input in the language, which will make it more likely that you will acquire your target language in a reasonable time frame. Reason number 2, and that is basically that I believe that there are emotional and motivational benefits with taking responsibility for your own language learning. It's kind of obvious, right? If you're only spending time with the language when you're with a tutor or an institution, can you really say that you're enjoying that language? Because otherwise, wouldn't you spend time with that language outside of the classroom? When you're not with the tutor, when you're not in an institution, it would be part of your everyday life, right? If you really enjoyed it. And there are benefits with having an emotional attachment to your language, or really enjoying the content, having interest in the language. One, it will help you remember things better as you engage with the language. Memory consolidation benefits with certain emotions, such as interest and enjoyment. And in order to acquire a language, you really need to get interested in the language. You need to almost fall in love with the language. Because one, partly it will help you to get more input, right? We do the things that we enjoy, we tend to do more, right? And as we do them more, we become competent. And as we become competent, we enjoy it more because we tend to enjoy things that we're competent at, and we tend to dislike things that we're not competent at. As a general rule, of course, there are many exceptions there. And the third reason that I will talk about is other forms of inherent limitations. And the first one is financial, right? For every hour you spend with a tutor, you have to pay money. And of course, if you're rich, that's not a problem. And you can spend how many hours you want with a tutor per day. But most of us, for students, for example, there's a financial cap on how much input then we could get. While you could easily get hours and hours of listening during a week by just finding audio and creating a playlist and listening to it on a daily basis. It's just a lot cheaper to take responsibility. And there's also the fact that you have to schedule lessons with a tutor. You can't do it on a whim. Your language learning will be dependent on other people's schedule. That's a limitation. And so in this video, I've basically been talking about limitations with relying on a tutor, relying on institutions. Of course, there are also things that tutors are good for, right? Tutors are good for activating your vocabulary, learning to negotiate for meaning when you're trying to speak. You're trying to make yourself comprehensible when you speak. And it can also be good for acquiring explicit knowledge about the language. So knowledge about the language, such as understanding of grammar, understanding of phonetics and pronunciation on an intellectual level. Well, that will not help you to directly acquire the language. It will help you maybe to notice things as you engage with the language. I would argue that might help you, but primarily for activating vocabulary. That's what I think a tutor is good for. And I think institutions like language schools and universities, they're mostly good for explicit knowledge. It's just hard to get enough input in these institutions and with tutors to use that as a primary source of inputs. We want to look at tutors and institutions as tools, and all tools, they have their uses and things that are not so good for. So you want to use tutors, what they're good for, and institutions, what they're good for. And then we want to take responsibility to make sure that we get everything these two are not good for, right? Like getting enough input. So basically what I'm saying here is that we want to be interdependent learners rather than dependent learners. Interdependent means that we're evaluating tools on an individual basis and basically using whatever is useful and discarding what is not useful and thinking for ourselves. Okay, so that was the end of this video. Thanks for listening. If you're interested in the topics of language learning and thinking about ideas, you might be interested in subscribing to my channel. And see you in the next video. Don't forget to leave a like below. Okay.